In the village of Mbali, Akina, a 23-year-old woman, walked alone among the narrow paths lined with thatched huts. Her beauty was known far and wide, too well known. It had become her curse. Her striking eyes, smooth dark skin, and graceful figure made her the object of envy among the village women. They called her names, whispered behind her back, and none would allow her near their husbands. She lived in isolation, more outcast than villager. Though her heart longed for companionship, she found no solace, only suspicion. The men of the village avoided her as well. They were all married or afraid, and the few who dared glance in her direction were met with the sharp glares of their wives. The other women who gathered at the river to wash clothes and bathe excluded her. Akina had grown used to washing her clothes alone, often after sunset, when no one else would be there to accuse her of trying to lure their husbands with her presence. Her only friends were the village children. They were too innocent to understand the jealousy that kept her apart from the others. They would chase her, laughing and playing, their joy a brief distraction from the loneliness that followed her everywhere. One evening, she walked down the well-trodden path toward the river, carrying a bundle of clothes on her head. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting a golden light over the world. She reached the river and knelt beside its edge, dipping her hands into the cool flowing water. As she began to scrub her garments, something caught her attention. Upstream, the water seemed to shimmer. At first, she thought it was the reflection of the setting sun, but as she watched, she realized the glow was coming from beneath the surface. Her heart pounded in her chest as the glowing light grew brighter, the water almost pulsing with it. Akina stood up, ready to run. Something was not right. She turned to leave, but a soft, gentle voice called her name. Akina. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was calm, soothing, like the gentle rush of the river itself. Akina, do not be afraid. She turned slowly toward the river, her eyes wide. Who's there? The water shimmered again, and the voice spoke once more. I have watched you, Akina, many times. You come here alone, washing your clothes while others bathe in laughter. I know your heart, and I feel your loneliness. Her pulse quickened, her mind racing to understand what was happening. Was this the spirit of the river speaking to her? Who are you? She whispered. I am the river, the voice said. The God who watches over these waters and the people who live beside it. I have seen your sorrow, Akina, and I have seen your beauty. Her knees felt weak, and she sank back down to the ground, gazing at the glowing water. The river god spoke to her in such a gentle way she almost felt as if he knew her more intimately than anyone ever had. She shook her head, trying to regain her senses. Why are you speaking to me? I've watched you come to the river each day, and I have fallen in love with you, the river god said. But I am bound to the water. I have no form, no body to touch you or hold you. But if you would allow it, Akina, I can be yours in another way. Her heart raced at the words. How? She asked breathlessly. If you agree, I will give you a husband, a man who will love you as no one else can. But there is a condition. I cannot come to you as I am. You must allow me to be born into the world, to be raised as your own. Akina blinked, confused. You mean you want me to give birth to you? Yes, the voice replied, soft yet unwavering. If you will bear me, I will grow quickly. I will become a man, and I will be the husband you deserve. But you must never tell anyone who I am or where I come from. If you do, our love will be cursed, and we will lose each other sooner than later. Akina's mind whirled with the impossibility of what the river god was asking, but then she thought of her life, of the long, lonely nights, of the days filled with nothing but isolation. Here, finally, was someone who saw her for who she truly was, someone who loved her. She nodded, her voice trembling. I'll do it. Come closer, the voice said gently. Akina stepped into the river, the water warm against her skin as she approached the glowing light. As she stood there, knee-deep in the shimmering water, she felt a strange sensation, like a current flowing through her body. It filled her, consumed her, and then the light vanished, leaving the river still and quiet once more. The next morning, Akina awoke in her hut to find her belly swollen, as if months of pregnancy had passed overnight. She gasped, her hands flying to her stomach. She could feel the life inside her, growing rapidly. Her heart raced with both wonder and fear. What had she agreed to? What would the village say? It wasn't long before the villagers began to notice. Akina, unmarried and untouched by any man, was visibly pregnant. The whispers started immediately. Women glared at her, pulling their husbands away as she walked past. Men glanced at her with suspicion, knowing they had nothing to do with it but unsure of what was happening. Akina tried to avoid their stares, but every day brought more gossip, more accusations. The women accused their husbands of infidelity, certain that one of them must have fathered the child. Tensions flared as men denied any wrongdoing, but the suspicions lingered. Meanwhile, the child inside Akina continued to grow at an alarming rate. Each day, her belly swelled larger, the baby moving and kicking with a strength that made her gasp. She marveled at how quickly the pregnancy progressed, knowing that soon her son, her river god, would be born. When the time came, it was during a violent storm. The wind howled and the rain poured down in torrents as Akina felt the first pangs of labor. She was alone in her small hut, clutching her belly as the pain racked her body. The storm drowned out her cries as she labored through the night. Finally, with one last agonizing push, the baby was born. Akina collapsed, her strength spent, and blacked out. When she awoke, the storm had passed, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the hut. She blinked, her vision blurry, until she saw him, a baby boy, crawling around on the dirt floor, his eyes bright and alert. Her heart swelled with joy and wonder as she reached out and scooped him into her arms. He was perfect, strong, healthy, and impossibly beautiful. His skin was smooth and glowing, his features striking even as an infant. "This is him," she whispered to herself. "This is the river god." She named him Zubari, a name meaning strength and power. The name fit him, for even as a baby she could feel his presence fill the small space around them. As the days passed, Zubari grew faster than any child Akina had ever seen. Within a week he was already the size of a young boy. His beauty was undeniable, and as Akina watched him, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride and love. He was everything the river god had promised, a child of immense strength and handsomeness. But there was something else in him too, a wisdom, an old soul in the eyes of a young boy. Word spread quickly across the village about Akina's miraculous child. The village women, still convinced she had somehow seduced one of their husbands, came to her hut to see the baby for themselves. Each woman hoped to find a resemblance between Zuberi and her own husband, a clue that would confirm their suspicions of infidelity. But when they arrived, they found something unexpected. Zuberi was more beautiful than any of their husbands. His features were so perfect, so divine, that it took their breath away. They stared at him in awe, and the jealousy they had felt for Akina turned into something closer to envy. How could she, of all people, have a child like this? "It is impossible," one of the women whispered. "No man in this village could have fathered such a child." "But how?" another asked. "She is not married. Who is his father?" When they pressed Akina for answers, she only smiled gently and shook her head. "He is my son, and that is all you need to know." The women left, frustrated but too mesmerized by the boy's beauty to argue further. And so the rumors shifted. Some whispered that Akina had been touched by a spirit, that her child was not of this world. Others said she had practiced witchcraft, calling upon dark forces to give her the child. Either way, the village remained suspicious, wary of the strange and rapid growth of the boy. Zuberi's growth did not stop. Within days, he became a teenager, his body developing at an unnatural speed. Akina could hardly believe it. She marveled at how swiftly he transformed before her eyes, and though she knew this was the river god's doing, it was still difficult to accept. His voice deepened, His frame grew taller and broader, and soon he was towering over her, his presence as commanding as it was graceful. The village women noticed too. They would visit Akina's hut under the guise of friendliness, but their eyes were always on Zuberi. His handsomeness captivated them, and the young girls of the village began to gather nearby, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. They laughed, giggled, and flirted, trying to gain his attention. Akina's frustration grew as she saw the way the village girls threw themselves at Zuberi. Though he was still her son, the emotions she felt for him began to shift as he became a man. He was no longer the child she had cradled in her arms, but a powerful, striking figure, her husband in the form of a man. She felt protective of him, and when the girls lingered too long around her hut, she chased them away with a stick. "They're just children," Zuberi said with a soft smile, one that seemed to calm her instantly. "They do not know what they seek." "But you are mine," she whispered fiercely. "You belong to me." Zuberi placed his hand gently on her shoulder, his touch sending warmth through her body. "Yes, mother, I belong to you alone." Days passed, and Zuberi's transformation was complete. He was no longer a boy or a teenager, but a man, tall, strong, and breathtakingly handsome. His presence was undeniable, and the village could no longer ignore the strange events that had occurred in Akina's life. People whispered of witchcraft, of unnatural forces at play, but no one could prove anything. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late, and Akina sat inside her hut, staring at the fire as its flames flickered and danced in the darkness. Zuberi was sitting close to her, his face illuminated by the warm light. His presence filled the space around them, and she could feel the weight of his gaze on her. She looked up, meeting his eyes. There was something different in them now, something more than the son she had raised. There was desire. Her heart raced as she realized what was happening. This was not just her son, he was her husband, the river god, the man who had loved her long before he took human form. The air between them grew thick with tension. Neither spoke, but the bond they shared was stronger than words. Slowly, Zuberi reached out, cupping her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, but the heat that radiated from him was intense. Akina's breath caught in her throat as he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. And then, they kissed. It was a kiss that ignited every part of her being, a kiss that felt both forbidden and inevitable. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she could hardly breathe. Her fingers tangled in his hair as the kiss deepened, their bodies pressed together in a way that felt natural, as though they had been destined for this moment. But outside, 2 women were passing by. They had been curious, hoping to catch a glimpse of the handsome man who lived with Akina. As they peeked through the window, what they saw shocked them to their core. Akina, the outcast, the woman they had always envied, was locked in a heated kiss with the man they thought was her son. They screamed and ran from the hut, their cries echoing through the village as they spread the news of what they had seen. The villagers, already suspicious of Akina's strange life, were outraged. They gathered quickly, torches in hand, and stormed toward her hut, ready to rid the village of the perversion they believed had taken place. The cries of the women spread like wildfire through the village, and soon a mob gathered outside Akina's hut. Torches flickered in the night, casting eerie shadows on the angry faces of the villagers. They were armed with sticks and stones, shouting accusations of witchcraft, perversion, and betrayal. The men were furious, their pride wounded by the thought that Akina had seduced her own son, while the women were filled with jealousy and disgust, seeing her as a wicked temptress. Akina and Zuberi stood inside the hut, hearing the growing chaos outside. Her heart pounded in her chest, fear mixing with confusion. How had it come to this? She had done nothing wrong. Zuberi was her husband, the river god she had promised to love. But how could she make the villagers understand? Zuberi stepped forward, his face calm but his body tense, ready to defend her. "Stay here," he said softly, his voice steady despite the danger. "I will handle this." Akina shook her head, grabbing his arm. "No, they will not listen to reason. They won't believe us." Zuberi turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "They may not believe, but they will see. I am not just a man. I am the river and I will protect you. Before Akina could protest, the door to the hut burst open. The villagers rushed in, led by the two women who had seen the kiss. Their faces twisted with disgust and fury as they pointed at Akina, their voices shrill with accusation. "There she is! The witch who kisses her own son!" one of them screamed. "She has bewitched him, cursed our village!" another shouted, waving her torch in the air. The men followed, gripping their weapons tightly, ready to drive Zuberi and Akina out of the village by force if necessary. But as they approached, Zuberi stood tall, his powerful presence halting them in their tracks. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, and for the first time the villagers saw something more than just a handsome man. They saw power, ancient, unstoppable power. "I am not her son," Zuberi said, his voice echoing through the room with an authority that sent chills down their spines. "I am the river god, the protector of these lands, and you have come here with false accusations." The villagers hesitated, their anger momentarily dampened by the weight of his words. The river god? Could it be true? Some of them exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to believe. Akina stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "He is my husband, not my son. We married in secret, and I have kept my promise to him. There is no witchcraft, no evil here, only love." The women gasped, horrified by her words. "You've gone mad," one of them shouted. "You expect us to believe such lies?" But Zuberi raised his hand, and a sudden silence fell over the room. His presence seemed to grow larger, more imposing, as if the very air around him thickened with his divine power. "You doubt me?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You doubt the river that gives you life, the waters that have sustained your crops and your families for generations?" He stepped closer to the crowd, and as he did, the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The air grew cooler, and the sound of rushing water echoed in the distance, though the river was far from the village. The villagers looked around in fear, realizing that they were standing in the presence of something far greater than they had ever known. "I have loved Akina from the moment I first saw her by the river, lonely and cast aside by all of you," Zuberi continued. "She gave me a body so that I could be with her. And now you come here to destroy us? To punish her for a love that is pure and true?" The villagers, now trembling, fell back slightly. Some lowered their weapons, their anger replaced by fear and awe. But not all were convinced. One of the older men stepped forward, his face hardened with suspicion. "If you are truly a god," the man said, "then prove it. Show us your power." Zuberi's eyes narrowed. He raised his hand once more, and this time the sound of water intensified. From the sky, a light rain began to fall, though the clouds were not heavy. It was soft at first, a gentle drizzle, but within moments, the rain turned to a downpour. The ground around them flooded quickly, and the villagers gasped as the river itself seemed to rise, its waters rushing toward them, though they were miles away from its banks. The villagers backed away in fear, their disbelief shattered by the sight of the water swirling at their feet. The rain fell harder, soaking them through, and they cried out for mercy. "Enough!" one of the women shouted, her voice shaking with terror. "We believe you. Please, stop!" Zuberi lowered his hand, and just as quickly as it had begun, the rain ceased. The waters receded, and the village was left in silence, the air heavy with the lingering presence of the river god's power. The villagers, drenched and humbled, fell to their knees before him. "Forgive us," the old man said, his voice breaking. "We did not know, we did not understand." Zuberi glanced at Akina, and she gave him a small, grateful nod. She knew that while the villagers now accepted the truth, their lives would never be the same. They could not stay here, not after what had happened. The village would always carry the weight of this night, and they would always be outsiders. Akina turned to the villagers, her heart heavy, but her voice steady. "We will leave this place so that you may have peace, but know this, our love is real and nothing you do will ever change that." With those final words, Akina and Zuberi turned away from the village, walking together into the darkness, their future uncertain but their love unwavering. Akina and Zuberi traveled far from the village, finding a place where they could live in peace, away from the judgment of others. They settled near the banks of another river, where the water flowed clear and strong, a reminder of the love that had brought them together. Zuberi, though no longer possessing all the powers of the river god, remained strong and devoted. He built a home for them, and they spent their days together, their bond deepening with each passing moment. Akina, who had once been so lonely, now found joy in the simple moments they shared, laughing, talking, and dreaming of the life they would build together. But as the years passed, Akina began to notice something strange. Zuberi, who had once been so youthful and full of energy, was beginning to change. His once vibrant features grew tired, and his body, once strong, seemed to weaken. One evening, as they sat by the river, Akina turned to him, worry etched on her face. "What is happening to you?" Zuberi smiled softly, taking her hand in his. "I was never meant to stay in this world for long. My time here is coming to an end. To protect you, I revealed my secret, and so I must leave you sooner than later." Akina's heart clenched in her chest. "No, you can't leave me, not after everything we've been through." "I will never truly leave you," Zuberi said, his voice gentle. "I am the river, Akina. I will always be with you, in the water, in the wind, in the land around us. But I cannot remain as I am." Tears welled in Akina's eyes as she clung to him. "I don't want to lose you." "You will never lose me," Zuberi whispered, brushing a tear from her cheek. "Our love is eternal." That night, as Akina held him close, Zuberi's body began to fade, his spirit returning to the river from which he came. She wept as she felt him slip away, but in her heart she knew he was still with her, forever a part of the water that flowed through the land. Years later, Akina sat by the river, now an old woman, her hair streaked with grey. She watched the water as it flowed, listening to the gentle rush of the current. Every day she came to the river, and every day she heard his voice in the sound of the water, calling her name softly, lovingly. Their love had transcended time, space, and life itself, and though she lived alone, she was never lonely. She knew that, in the end, they would be together once more. And so, as the sun set over the horizon, Akina smiled, her heart full of peace, as the river whispered its eternal song of love.